Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're talking about the final episode of the White Lotus, and either you really loved it or you thought it was a complete flop. And I felt so bad for Armond. He literally died doing what he hated at the hands of someone who embodied everything that he hates. And you know, this was a very slow burn, and it was a slow burn in terms of character development, right? So by the end of the episode, I really felt like we got to know all the characters. And that's really a testament to, you know, very, very strong creative writing. And again, maybe you hated it, maybe you loved it, I don't know. Personally, I really enjoyed myself. I think ultimately this is a comedic satire about the limits of one's experience, right? And you see that at the start of the episode when you contrast Quinn and Rachel. And Quinn is weird because I like him and I root for him and I'm happy that he found his niche. But he would not have found his niche had he not been granted this privilege to kind of stay at this very posh hotel. And then you have Rachel, who is coming to the realization that this is the start of her not so beautiful life. So we'll start with Shane and Rachel, and she wakes up and she's horrified. Like, she looks like she doesn't even want to touch him. She looks disgusted. And I find it odd that up until the conversation where she tells him like, hey, I don't like you, I don't love you, you are a mistake. Like, he doesn't even process that she's uncomfortable or unhappy. And she's able to kind of free herself and tell him like, hey, I'm gonna go get a facial. And like, she just needs to get away from him. This time apart was super interesting because we get to the sort of final breakfast scene and Shane is by himself. And this is the first time he's been by himself. And he talks to Nicole and Mark. So this is the first time they're interacting, which is really interesting. And the only reason he kind of interacts with them is that he notices the sort of bruise on Mark's face. And Mark and Nicole are super happy. They're making love again. Their vacation was awesome. You know, as far as they're concerned, like, this is the start of something beautiful. And poor Paula is sitting there horrified. And we'll talk about Paula, but she is just on the outside looking in. She's counting the minutes until this sort of horrible vacation is over for her. And during this conversation, Shane kind of comes to the realization that there was a break-in. And not only that, like, nobody at the hotel told them that there was a break-in. And he just goes off, right? He goes back to the room. He calls his mom's travel agent. And he's just like, he's infuriated, right? And it's weird to me, his obsession with Armond, right? It's like, it's already bad enough that you're going to get him fired. And if the hotel had something to say, they probably would have told you, right? But for Shane, this is just another sign that, you know, everything is coming at him, you know? So his fixation to just, his immediate response to kind of tell management and kind of, you know, have somebody like ring somebody's head. And again, Shane has this he has like an inferiority complex, right? Like he feels this need to like reestablish his power. And I think he just kind of gets off on that. During this time, Rachel comes back from her spa, and I felt really bad for Rachel because before her facial, you know, she has this conversation with Belinda, and this is before Belinda's breaking point. And she's crying, and Belinda can see she's super upset, and she kind of sits down with her, and Rachel says, you know, it's about my marriage. Do you have an extra room that I can stay in? And Belinda was very concerned as she was talking to Rachel, like you could see it in her face. She gives her card. She says, if you need anything, let me know. And I feel like that interaction just before she talks to Shane is kind of the thing that gave her some hope, like maybe she'll have some support, you know? And I felt really bad because I think it is true, like, hurt people hurt. So after her facial, Rachel goes back in, and she's horrified that he's still obsessed with this hotel, right? Like, they get everything they want. They get this ugly-ass pineapple suite, and he's still complaining. And so we get to what I think is one of the craziest scenes apart from the end, and it's sort of Rachel's confession. So she finally tells him like, hey, I made a mistake in marrying you. And up until she says that, he doesn't process that she's standing there upset. He doesn't process that she's uncomfortable. Like, he is just in his own world, and if he's happy, then everybody's happy, you know? And her logic is really interesting because she kind of admits like, hey, I met you at a time where my career wasn't that great. I wasn't very happy with myself. You know, I wasn't rich, and sort of you are a knight in shining armor, right? Like, he kind of came around, all these doors open, and suddenly she was in the proximity of people that you could only dream about. And I think it's really scary for someone like Rachel because you go from being Rachel to Shane's husband, and that's your identity from here on out. You will always be known as this guy's husband. And she says something quite beautiful. She's like, well, I don't really want to be a +1 for the rest of my life, because she has no identity at this point, right? It doesn't matter. Nobody cares about her. They only care about her insofar as she's attached to him. And he is not understanding her unhappiness. He's not really getting like what's really going on with her. And he goes off. You know, Shane's logic is, so what you're telling me is that you're unhappy because you're unsuccessful and you blame me for it? And he said something quite condescending. He said, well, I thought you were this cool, confident person. I didn't realize you were like an insecure baby. And his whole logic is really interesting, because Shane feels like he's a very successful person. And it's like, your success is as a result of all this money you have. And it seems like you only have power insofar, like through his mother's connections, because any sort of power that we've seen him exhibit is through his mother, right? His mother's travel agency. She booked the hotel. She organized the wedding. She did everything. Like, he doesn't do anything. So where this power is coming from, like where his success, like he has a very inflated sense of self. And so he just kind of took it as, you're insecure and you need to get over it. And I do think that he loves her. Like, I don't think, Shane is a weird guy, but it's conditional love, right? Like he only loves her insofar as she makes him happy. And the minute that doesn't work, he's done, right? Like, everything is fine if he's fine. And so this conversation was quite explosive, and I felt bad for Rachel, because you have this contrast between like trophy wife and man baby, right? Like, she doesn't want to be this person that's just pretty and there and at his beck and call. And she calls him out. She calls him a man baby, you know? And the audacity, like when he said that she was an insecure baby, I was like, says the guy who called his mom to fire, you know, the hotel manager. Like, this guy has been complaining and bitching and just being an awful human being this whole time. And just the irony of that situation. But I understood Rachel's point. You know, it's very difficult to be attached to somebody who kind of has like unlimited potential due to the resources that he has. And Rachel's in a weird position, because she can kind of compare her life to the life that Shane can give her, and it's not comparable. If she's alone, there's a glass ceiling, you know, in terms of material items, in terms of what she can see, in terms of just being at a hotel like that, right? Like, just simply being there is a privilege. So this is something that I think she's struggling with. So he kind of gives her some time. He says, you know what, I'm going to leave. You need to think about what you've done. And he kind of goes off, and she's just left in the room crying. And now Shane is just pissed, right? Like, his wife is angry with him, and Armond is angry with him. And speaking of Armond, like, this was the beginning of the end for him. Like, this episode, he tried, you know, like you could see like he was trying to get back on track, but he knew the end was coming. And his end kind of began at breakfast. So he's still trying to make it up to Nicole's family in terms of this break-in, right? And it would be one thing if it was like a random break-in or one of the guests or something, I don't know. But the fact that it was somebody that worked at the hotel, he doesn't look great as a manager. So he's always going up to Nicole and making sure everything's okay. And then, you know, as the day goes on, he kind of drops it to them that, hey, they found Kai. They found the person who kind of broke into their hotel room, and they were able to retrieve all the items. And when they dropped this information, it was so quick. And I don't know, a part of me was like kind of shocked, like, oh my God, you caught him? But looking back on it, like, he was always gonna get caught, you know what I mean? Like, it didn't take much to figure out who did it. And what's worse is, while Armond is breaking the news, I think Olivia asks, like, hey, what was the name of the guy who broke in and took all our stuff? And he's like, oh, his name was Kai. And as soon as he said that, like, Paula's face dropped. And it's to the point where, like, Paula can't even hide it anymore. Like, there's no use in hiding. It's like, it's so obvious that you were involved. And now it's a matter of whether or not Olivia will kind of go after you or let it go. And so they get to this dive boat, and she's throwing up, and, you know, Nicole is looking at her like she really does have problems. And it's really good. Like, if Nicole ever found out that Paula was involved somehow, she would have had a field day. She would have gone in on her. Like, at this point, the family is done with Paula. Like, they never want to see her again. They don't really care that she's throwing up. And Olivia is just like I don't know what else to do, right? So we get to this conversation between Paula and Olivia just kind of straight up confronts her like, hey, are you sad because you're, afraid of going to jail? And Paula is just like, there's not a lot she can say, right? At the end of the day, it's pretty obvious that you are involved somehow. And the way that Olivia like downplays it is quite stunning, right? She's like, do you need money? Is that what this is about? Like, is this some sort of heist? Like, are you, kind of trying to reestablish her power? Like, if you needed money, I could have helped you out. And she doesn't really see the problem. And Paula tries to explain it to her like, listen, girl, like, I was trying to help out somebody that I really liked, and now it's a complete disaster. And the reason that someone like Olivia doesn't see it is because it's not stealing when you think everything is yours. And it wasn't until this conversation that I was looking at Olivia, like, she was crying. Like, she really was hurt by Paula, and she really thinks that she's this kind of woke liberal or something. Like, she doesn't see. She really felt like, I don't know, like, how she sees herself is totally different, because I was 90% sure Olivia was going to snitch her out, or she was going to like something really bad was going to happen. Instead, she was just genuinely hurt that Paula saw her this way. And then she tries to restore her humanity by saying, you know what, something bad could have happened to my mom. And Paula said, girl, something bad did happen. Like, this man went to jail, all because, I tried to help him and I messed it up. And I don't know how I feel about Olivia in this moment, because there was like a few sort of scenes where I thought she was going to go up to Nicole and kind of tell her everything, but she never does. But this conversation between Paula and Olivia was good, because you kind of see the psychology, right? Like, it's not as simple as it looks. Like, Olivia really feels like, and we've all seen people like this, like, they think they're really good people and they surround themselves with people that make them look like good people, but underneath it's all very superficial. And they have this conversation about like tribalism, and ultimately it's about hierarchy, right? And in order for you to have what you want, somebody has to lose, right? And that's what Paula was trying to communicate, right? Like, for you guys to be here, literally staying at this hotel, somebody else had to be displaced. And for you not to see or recognize the bigger picture just speaks to your, it just speaks to your power, right? And that's the whole thing, right? You have all these people at this hotel, and because most of these guests are all the same, there's this need to reestablish hierarchy. And throughout the series, Olivia has been trying desperately to kind of gain power over Paula. And I think in this moment she realized, like, damn, I really am a bad person, right? The other thing about this whole tribalism thing is, if one side doesn't get what it wants, it either asks for what it wants or it gets it by force, right? And you see that with Armond and Shane. And the way Armond was fired was stunning. Like, he picks up the phone and he's fired on the spot, and there's no explanation. He doesn't get a chance to explain himself. He doesn't, which I found very peculiar, because a lot of what Shane said was probably super spectacular. And Armond had been working there for quite some time, it seems, and he's very professional from before the drugs. Like, I don't know, you would think that they'd want to sit down with him and get his side of the story, but he was just disposable, replaceable, and he's horrified. He's like, F this place, I don't really care anymore, and he kind of goes off, right? And it's really sad, because just after he got the phone call, Belinda comes up to him and she's like, hey, Shane's wife, like, trying to give him an out. And for a minute, I really thought Rachel's situation could help Armond, like something would happen where he can kind of weave a story where he was actually really concerned about this guest and his wife, or like something that would get him out of this trouble. But Armond was like, he just goes off. He invites other hotel workers back to his office. He's like, leave the door open, don't leave the door open. And they basically finish the rest of the drugs that they stole from Paula and Olivia. And Armond at this point is just done. He's super done. And you see that in the Last Supper scene. And a lot of people don't understand, like, this is someone like Armond. When you work in this type of industry, it's very performative, like night in and night out, like you're talking to people, and it takes a long time to kind of perfect this skill. And so he's going out for his last supper, right? Like, i.e. his last performance. He's totally high, he's totally out of his mind. And he still takes some pride in nailing it, because ultimately it is a job, and it's not a job everyone can do well. And so he's seating everybody, he's smiling ear to ear. And if you ever worked in customer service, like the longer you work in it, you develop this kind of like permanent smile on your face. Like if you ever meet people who are very smiley or just naturally like very good at small talk, chances are they've worked in customer service for a long time. And so Armond is like, you know what? You're not gonna shame me out of this place. And as he's going around, like Shane is looking at him like, this guy is totally high. Like it's obvious. There's what he thinks he looks like and what he actually looks like. So to everyone else, he probably looked high as hell. And Shane is looking at him like really fixated on him. And I think it's really interesting that his wife is sitting there like totally disheveled, totally on the brink of tears. And his reaction is, there's something off about this guy. So we'll talk about this Last Supper, and we'll start with Shane and Rachel. And Rachel is done, right? Like she can't even pick at her food. And he's confused still. He's like, why are you doing this? You're ruining a good thing. And she says something interesting like, you know, when I'm with you, I feel alone. And he's just like, okay, then be alone. And he gets up and leaves. And this whole conversation pretty much orchestrates the end, right? Like it pretty much gets us to the most chaotic final scene I have seen in a long time. So Shane gets up, goes to the bar, and he decides, you know what? I'm just gonna let her cool off. Rachel is sitting there, she has her own hotel room. And this time that they spend apart is critical, because it's this time apart that unfortunately brings them back together again. So Shane goes somewhere, Rachel goes somewhere, and Armond goes back to his party. And Armond gets so drunk and so wasted that he starts to hear voices. And these voices basically tell him to go into Shane's room and shit in his suitcase. And when he walked into this room, I was horrified. I was like, oh man, like this can't get any worse. And then when he opened his suitcase and we saw him, like I had to close my eyes because I wasn't expecting it. And it was just the most like disgusting / satisfying thing I've seen in a long time. And of course, the minute he's kind of done, Shane walks in, which is, I was hoping Rachel would walk in, you know, like anybody but Shane. And Armond kind of locks himself into the, you know, into a closet, and Shane is just pissed off. He's tired. He gets a message basically telling him that his wife is at another room. She got her own room, and this just depresses him, and he's just done. And I have to say, like Shane is a weird guy, because he's so, as much as he annoys me, he's a very observant person, right? Like he kind of like is in the room, he kind of senses that something's off, and he can kind of smell something, and he's smelling, and he gets to the suitcase and he sees like that somebody shit in his suitcase, and he just goes off. He gets on the phone, he starts yelling, he starts screaming, he starts just, you know, just being like unbelievably like, he's done with this hotel at this point. He's done with everybody at this hotel. And it's quite concerning, because he kept talking about them being targets and how, you know, the hotel wasn't protecting them. So, you know, even if Armond didn't get fired for something, like the things were like, everything was just kind of adding up. And poor Armond, like he tries to escape. And as soon as he got out of the closet, I knew something bad was gonna happen, because it just, like the angle was so weird. And he kind of makes a slight noise, and, you know, up until that moment, I didn't know what was gonna happen, you know? And when he stabs him, like that was quite dramatic. And I think Shane was so gung-ho about like being a hero, and about like, because he was so sure that they were gonna be targets and things, so he stabbed Armond, and as soon as he stabbed him, he realized he made a mistake, right? Like he kind of manifested this sort of disaster, and he runs. Right, he runs. He doesn't check to see if he's okay. He doesn't check to see like if the man is still breathing. Like he just gets out of there. Like it's not his problem. And poor Armond, like can you imagine dying at work? Like he literally dies at work, and he's looking up like he's done. You know, he's done. As if he died in a, like this is the worst possible death for a service worker, I feel like. And as soon as he, you know, this whole incident happens, the police are called, and what's even worse is the fact that he's replaced by a doppelganger. Like they literally have a new manager who has the same jacket and the same everything. And Armand's demise it just goes to show, right? Like, at the end of the day, like, you're so replaceable. You don't really mean anything. And, you piss off the wrong person. It doesn't matter, like 10, 20, 30 years of service, like, you're done. And so watching Armond die at his job, that he kind of, it was truly a nightmare. Okay, so with that, we kind of come full circle and we realize who's in the casket and why Shane is alone at the airport. And it's so weird watching all these guests depart, right? Like, here you have somebody literally got killed, and as you're watching everybody kind of depart, it's quite concerning, right? Like, Nicole and Mark are having a great time. Paula and Olivia, I'm not really sure what's going to happen with them. Like, there's some type of weird vibe. And just before, like, the only kind of consolation I thought was that Rachel had left Shane up until the final moments when she comes to the airport and she hugs him and says, I'm going to be happy, I can be happy. And this was really sad because the reason that Rachel comes back is because she kind of comes to the realization that she's limited. As extraordinary or as much potential as she feels she has, like, the odds of her ever reaching that potential are quite low. You know what I mean? Like, and I think she realized it after kind of being in a room by herself and talking to Belinda. So she's in a room, and this scene with Belinda was quite tragic because the lead up to it was a disaster. And I'll just touch on what happened between Belinda and Tanya before I get to Belinda and Rachel. So throughout the show, Belinda has been very hopeful that Tanya would kind of help jumpstart her business. But as the episodes go on, it's clear that Tanya doesn't really care about her. And it kind of came, sadly, like, so Tanya kind of comes up to her, and Belinda is trying really hard, right? She's like asking her about herself. She's really trying to like keep a positive outlook. And then Tanya kind of breaks it to her like, hey, I don't think I can go on with this business proposal. And her logic was quite selfish, right? Like, she doesn't want to help Belinda because she doesn't want to enter into any more transactional relationships because that's not really good for her. And she's saying this knowing full well that she could fully change Belinda's life, right? So the reason I can't give this to you is because it's not good for me. And that just sent me. I was like, lady. And what made it worse is that she gives her a wad of cash, like she's some sort of prostitute. Like, she kind of gives her a wad of cash, like, just to kind of be like, I hope this does it for you. You know what I mean? And Belinda just breaks down. She breaks down because she feels stupid, she feels used. And as she's crying, Tanya comes back. And I thought for a minute Tanya would kind of say something useful. And instead, she grabs her sunglasses. And she's like, sorry, like, I forgot my sunglasses. I mean, she could care less. And I think the only consolation is that Tanya will most definitely get screwed. Because it's kind of hinted that maybe this guy Greg is a bit of a con artist. Because at one point he was swimming. And I think this hot guy sat next to her. And she says something like, oh, that spot is taken or something. And there is something off about Greg. You know, he says that he's dying. And that's what the coughs are for. And she kind of blindly trusts him. And they're going to Aspen. So I really hope karma comes to get her. But this sort of interaction with Tanya totally drains and kills Belinda to the point where she has nothing to offer for Rachel, right? So she's sitting across Rachel. She feels used. She feels tired. And here's somebody who actually did need her help and energy. And she's listening to this woman talk about her miserable honeymoon. And even though Belinda knows, like, everything Rachel is saying is probably true, she just doesn't care, right? She says, you want advice? Girl, I'm all out of advice. And she gets up and leaves. And it's this that kind of, I think, Rachel's mind started turning. And she kind of comes to realize, you know what? The grass isn't green anywhere I go, right? And so she goes back to her husband. And at first I thought this was quite a jaded ending. I'm like, really? You know? And this is just the start of a horrible relationship, right? Like, she's basically substituting, you know, she kind of has to be happy with all these material things and hope, you know, she can kind of, that these material items will kind of make up for, you know, her spiritual deterioration, as we'll say. The more I thought about it, it's a realistic ending because there's a lot of Rachels out there, you know, people who have, again, a lot of potential, They can do a lot with their lives, but you take someone like Shane, it's incomparable, right? Like at the end of the day, you cannot give yourself the life that he can give you. So you kind of just, it's hard to say, you know, like you do what you have to do, and that's how the series ends. And the ending was, the ending was a lot, you know what I mean? So I personally loved the ending, you know, Quinn kind of running away and joining the, you know, living his life as a, I guess he wants to just canoe there and live his life. He found purpose. He said something interesting. He said everything back home is dead. And I am happy that he found his purpose, but again, he gets the best of both worlds. And the way that they were all kind of waving the guests goodbye, like, I mean, the thing about being a service worker is that you're so disposable and interchangeable. Like, your job is not one that cannot be replaced. And so oftentimes you end up putting everything into these jobs, but it ends up taking everything from you, as it quite literally did with Armond. Like, he gave everything and it took away everything. So in the end, it wasn't worth it. Overall, I thought it was brilliant. I love Armond. I think he was like one of the best characters I've seen. I relate to everything that he does. This desire to please and do your best. You know, you want to impress people. You want to just like, you know, there are days where you want to give it your all, but at the same time, in the back of your mind, you know that it's bullshit. You know, like he kind of represents like the working man quite well. And he's reached his limits, right? Like he's kind of working to work. And the fact that the job literally took his life away, I mean, I can't imagine a fate worse than dying at work. So overall, I thought it was brilliant. You either loved it or you hated it, but I enjoyed myself. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.